I first had a taste of the downtown scene in New York when Studio 54 opened. I was curious because I'd heard so much and read so much in the paper about Studio 54. I was curious to see what was going on. So I went up there a couple of times without my camera just to see if I could get in. And I think I stood there with some friends for an hour or so, and we could never get in. So I did that a couple of times, and it was a place I was curious about because it was so popular and it was so different from what was going on in New York at that time that I hoped that sometime I could get in. At the same time, I was working at the Village Voice. One night, I was assigned to go to Studio 54 to cover an event. Lillian Carter, President Carter's mother, was being honored with an award for some voluntary work that she did in India. It was a black tie dinner affair. So I got the assignment to go there. I was on the press list when I walked in, so I was allowed right in the door. So it was, it was my first experience going there, and I honestly didn't know what to expect. I shot the event itself. There was a lot of paparazzi there that night, and paparazzi was kind of almost a new word in the 70s. Having gangs of photographers, piling up on each other, photographing an event, photographing a celebrity, that was sort of a new thing. It wasn't something I was used to doing. I was used to shooting people, just me and them, or in a studio. So that whole kind of, event photography with, a group of photographers around me was very new to me. So what I ended up photographing at first was this mass of photographers that I saw in front of me, because I thought that was the interesting shot. And then I eventually got around to shooting Lillian Carter when she was sitting at her table, and she was sitting with Andy Warhol. And the two of them were pretty engaged in a conversation. I shot a couple of shots of them. And then there was a fashion show. There were some other things going on. There was a little bit of dancing. At that point, after it was over, basically the photographers started leaving. I was out of film, so I found a photographer and bought like 10 rolls of film off of him before he left. And I decided that since I'm here, I'm going to stay here, because who knows if I'm ever going to get back into Studio 54 again. I hid out in the balcony and waited for them to clean up. They started letting the regular crowd in, I guess maybe around 11 o'clock. And I slowly came downstairs, and I wasn't sure what I was going to see. I wasn't sure if I was going to see New York City yuppies, reasonably upscale, or what I was going to see. So I was really surprised when I saw the crowd that came in there, which was a very diverse, inclusive, mixed crowd of people. And so I felt like this was really interesting. It wasn't what I expected, and it really caught my eye. And as a young photographer who is always looking for a personal project to do, I felt like there was really something here. Now, I can't say at this point that I knew exactly what I was seeing and how it was going to affect the mainstream culture in 40 years from that day. But I saw something, and something clicked inside me that said that there is an inclusiveness here that I've never seen before. And there was a vibe in the room that was interesting. So I started shooting some of the regulars. I came away with some great imagery that night. In fact, one of the contact sheets on the wall is from that night, kind of really captured a lot of what I was seeing all the way through. That was my first exposure to it. And I started to feel like there was something going on in New York. And when I look back at it, I understand what it was, although I didn't necessarily understand it then. But there were lots of movements going on culturally during the 60s and the 70s. There was a civil rights movement. There was the women's movement. There was the LGBT movement. There was just a feeling of creativity in the air in New York City at that point. Rents were cheap because the city was near bankruptcy. It was a very inexpensive place to live, much like Berlin back when the wall came down. I think my apartment in Soho was $90 a month at that point. And I don't even think it was called Soho back then. A refreshing air of creativity and inclusion going on in New York City against the backdrop of a city almost in default. Like the East Village back then was a place that you didn't really go to. It was dangerous to go to the East Village. The Upper West Side was dangerous to go to. There were pockets of the city that you just didn't go to. But there was a ton of creativity going on. That's what caught my eye, and that's what I started looking for.
Or pull another one out. Okay.
Back then was a lot different in terms of like the camera culture. Not everybody had a camera back then. And generally speaking, if you had a camera, you were most likely a professional photographer versus the culture today where everybody has a smartphone and you have a different world of social media today, which you didn't back then. When I walked in with my Canon F1 and my Vivitar flash, it was pretty much assumed that I was a professional photographer. I also had my Village Voice press credentials. After I originally got into Studio 54 the first time, I was able to talk to the doorman. I was able to meet Steve Rebell that first night. They kind of knew who I was. They knew I was one of the voice photographers. The next time I went in there, I just showed them my credentials and I was allowed in. Generally, I would call like sometime during the day and tell whoever I could talk to, the manager or whoever was on the other end of the phone, that I would be coming that night. And I was bringing my camera and that I was working on a project. And I would say for the Village Voice, which wasn't exactly true, but it helped get in there. And the Village Voice was looking at my work and they would run some of my work from time to time. But that's pretty much how I was able to get in. I was the Village Voice photographer. Like I said, when you went to the clubs, you were generally speaking the only photographer there. If there was some sort of special event, there would be more photographers there. But most of the time that I went, I was the only photographer. I would say back then that most people were willing to be photographed. They weren't as jaded and they weren't as posed as people are today. People are much more media savvy today than they were back then. It was a whole different world. And if a photographer came by like myself and, pointed my camera at them, they tended to think that I was either an artist who is doing a project on nightlife, which I was, or that I was with the press. And that if they were lucky, their picture would end up on, page 6 of the Post or somewhere, So it really, it was different. I don't think I can remember anyone ever telling me not to take their picture. I didn't always ask. I would generally walk up, stand there, and snap a couple of pictures. If they asked me a question, I would, I would just tell them I was working on a personal project or I was with the Village Voice. There was a whole different kind of reaction to being photographed. They didn't have to worry about looking compromised or stupid and then all of a sudden being on the web, on Instagram, and everybody in the world can see their picture, So no, I didn't have any problems photographing people back then. Let's see. That looks good. It's almost actually like if I had a marker at this size, it would almost be like that.
Yeah.
Like a red marker. So a contact sheet is what you make as a photographer after you have shot your film. In this case, the film I was using was primarily Tri-X film, which was a 400 ASA black and white film, 35 millimeter, made by Kodak. It was a very popular film. It was kind of almost the standard for photojournalists of the day and art photographers, street photographers of the day. There was sort of no question that if you were doing street photography or documentary photography that you would use Tri-X film. The roll had 36 pictures on it, and each picture was numbered. When you developed your negatives in the dark, you would hang them up to dry in a long strip. And after a couple of hours of drying, you cut them into either 5s or 6s or whatever you're used to working with. And you go into the darkroom with those strips and you lay them out on a light-sensitive piece of paper and you hit it with some light from your enlarger, 10 seconds, whatever it was. And then in the dark with the red light on, you put it in the developer and then the fixer. And in a couple of minutes, you can turn the lights on. You see these strips of the work that you've done. That's how it was done. And you would take that after it was dried, and you would use what they call a loop magnifying glass, and you'd put it right up to the contact sheet, and you would mark with a pencil what you liked. And if there was something you wanted to crop, you would crop it with the pencil. If there was something that you want to look at later, you might make some sort of mark on it. If there was like one that really stood out, I used to make a couple of X's on it. So by the next day, after you've developed all your film and major contact sheets, you have your 5, 10, 15 rolls, whatever you shot, and it's all been ID'd. It's all been, logged in. I had my own login system. The contact sheets that I'm using on this exhibit, ID'd related to the envelope that it was in and to my system of keeping track of all my job. When I ID'd the contact sheets for this exhibit, I put the actual reference number to my own particular filing system on them. So that was the contact sheet, and that was what we used as photographers for years and years and years until digital photography came along. I would say probably happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. One of the differences with digital technology and shooting with digital cameras versus film, you think in terms of like the cost of the processing of the film and the printing of the film, and you're much more cost conscious as a young photographer. Each roll costs $3, $4, $5, and then it costs about that to have it processed. So all of this was, as you're starting out, made a big difference. So with digital, it's unlimited. You fill up the card and you put it on your hard drive, and then you erase the card and you start all over again. So the economics are totally different. I ended up shooting, I would say, less as a film photographer than as a digital photographer. I switched to digital photography in around 2001 because I went on the road with Paul McCartney as his tour photographer. And that involved shooting every night, the equivalent of maybe 5 or 10, 15 rolls every night. And he wanted to see film. He wanted to see images like the next day. So it was much easier to do it digitally on a computer than it was having it processed in different cities. This printing is so amazing. Scanning these little tiny negatives. Paradise Garage was downtown on King Street, kind of in a no man's land in New York City. And it was a parking garage. What I remember about that area was there were a lot of printing places in that area. It was pretty industrial during that time period. Since then, it's become a whole different place in New York City. And like I said, it was a parking garage, and they had like a drive-up ramp that when you entered, you would walk up, and then you'd make a sharp right, and you'd be in this, what was a parking garage area, but is now customized to be a disco. There was a stage because they had some live performances there. The lighting was fine. It wasn't the spectacle that places like Studio 54 or Xenon were, where sets would drop down during the course of the night. This was a fairly modest environment, but what it did have, state-of-the-art sound system. It also had like a state-of-the-art DJ named Larry Levan, who was, at this point in time, he's almost like a mythical character, sort of godlike in the realm of the DJ world and the music world. And it's well-deserved, I would say, because he was somebody who did it his way, so to speak. He played what he liked, and he played what he felt was needed in the moment. So he wasn't as influenced by big record companies and music people, and he wasn't trying to push their music. He was feeling the crowd, and he was seeing what it needed, and he was remembering what he thought was great, and he was playing that for the crowd. And it was almost like a sense of worship going on between the crowd and Larry Levan. In fact, they used to call Saturday night mass, which started at about 2:00 in the morning Saturday and went through Saturday night into Sunday morning. And again, it was really not a spectacle sort of a place like some of the other discos. And the crowd was mostly African American, Latin, white, primarily gay. It was a place that was well known, but not as well known as it's become over the years. It was almost rediscovered for what it was, which was like an amazing place to go and just lose your mind for the night. They didn't have a liquor license. They had juice and they had fruit. You would stay hydrated. It was really a hot, sweaty place. They would just open up the windows, these gigantic industrial windows. But people brought ways of getting high. Poppers were really big back then, so that smell of amyl nitrate just permeated the room when you walked in there. Marijuana was there. People brought their own alcohol, I'm sure. Cocaine. Anything that kept you going was what on the dance floor. Any drug that kept you going. Unlike other clubs, it was about staying up and dancing all night long. So that was the energy. And the picture that I took of the dance floor, I think captures that energy. No, there were no posers. It wasn't about that at all. It was a place to go and dance, hang out with your friends, be there all night long. And it had a very loyal crowd. People went there for years. That was Paradise Garage, really a special place.
And then if there's any way, it's much easier to bring out a little more detail.
I think the sharp one might do it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Hold it. It might be.
The crowd at Studio 54 was unique. My take on it was because of a few things, because it did have the celebrity draw to it. That was a big part of trying to make Studio 54 a success to the two owners, Steve Rebell and Ian Traeger. Get celebrities to come, because that would get them in the newspapers and that would get publicity. So there was that aspect to it, the celebrity aspect. There was also the velvet rope aspect to it, which was pretty new. I had never seen that in New York City. I'd seen a velvet rope when there were like movie openings or very special parties or events, one-night events, where they'd check the guest list and there'd be a crowd outside. But on a nightly basis, I'd never seen a velvet rope like that with a crowd standing outside. There was always the hope that you could get into Studio 54. People would stand out there for hours trying to get in. And what they were doing was interesting. They were not just letting in celebrities, because there's some famous instances where celebrities were not allowed in, and they ran off and, wrote songs about it. But they were looking to cast a party that was going on inside. They were looking for an inclusive, interesting crowd that created the right kind of vibe. But Steve Rebell used to constantly go in and out and feel the vibe of the room and go back out to the entrance and start looking for the right look of people, the right vibe of person to let in. That's how he created pretty much the magic that happened at Studio 54 night after night. I mean, this isn't just on the weekends, Friday and Saturday. This was like on a Tuesday night. So I give him a lot of credit for doing that. A lot of people felt that a lot of people feel that it's wrong to say that there was inclusion on the dance floor of Studio 54 because, well, why was it so hard to get in if they're being inclusive? And that's an interesting paradoxical thought. But as Andy Warhol said, Studio 54 was a dictatorship at the door and a democracy on the dance floor. So, and I think that kind of sums it up. It was a caste party, and it was part of the mentality behind the casting was make it inclusive. Let's see freedom of expression. Let's have good vibes. Let's create a really great party. And so that's what he was doing every night. And I give him a lot of credit for that.
Yeah. I think it looks more natural. She looks better. Again, she's kind of gothic.
Yeah.
You want to try another strip going down a little more?
Sure.
Like another,
Yeah.
like 5%?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, good. Studio 54, the two co-owners, Ian Traeger and Steve Rebell, did have a very high profile in the media. You know, people knew their names, which was unusual because that was not the case in most other clubs. They were known because there was an aura of celebrity about the club, Studio 54. Steve Rubell was very much a part of that. He wanted that to be how Studio 54 was perceived by the general public, as well as being an inclusive place with freedom of expression and generally a great party for interesting people in New York City at that time. Ian Traeger was sort of like, he was kind of like the backroom guy. But he was responsible for a lot of the scenery that was created and the look and the feel of Studio 54. But he wasn't really a front man. Steve Rebell was really the face of Studio 54. He was the person that would stand outside with the doorman. He would be inside. He'd be dancing. He'd be partying. He'd be socializing. He'd be handing out quaaludes. He was the mixer, of the party. So Steve Rebell was really kind of the face of it. Steve Rebell was floating around. That was very different than other clubs. They created this mythology back then, and they were part of it. That kind of led to their own demise, but that's a whole other story. The Mud Club was one of those clubs that you would hear about. It was not it never reached the sort of like mainstream media like Studio 54 did, or even Xenon. It was downtown, again, like Paradise Garage, but on the other side of town. Again, in like a very vacated, empty part of New York City that was mostly like, manufacturing, I would say. And it was nondescript, really, from the outside. I think there was a little bit of like Letraset type on the window that said Mud Club. But you'd go down there and at first there was no doorman, but eventually as it became more and more popular, there was a doorman and more celebrities started going there as time went on. And occasionally you would see the limousine pull up in front. But the crowd itself and the vibe itself and the music and the costume was really more of a downtown New York City artist, punk-ish sort of feeling, anti-establishment, anti-disco for sure. It was sort of the antidote for Studio 54 at that point. The music was The Clash and The Police and more English punk rock. The drug was more Secanols, which are very intense sedative sleeping pills. There was still the marijuana, but it was more of a downer kind of vibe than Paradise Garage or Studio 54. I don't recall seeing that much in the way of cocaine there, but, there might have been. There probably was. There's probably everything, but the overall vibe was much more of a down energy punk. There was a little bit of a political sense to the place. There were a lot of political things going on back then in the late 70s, like in Nicaragua, for example, with the Sandinistas. And so there was a political consciousness back then. And again, a punk sort of vibe to it. Xenon came along a little after Studio 54 opened up, and it never really caught on in the same way. It never really achieved, no one could really do what Studio 54 was doing. They were kind of the originals. But Xenon came close, and Xenon was also the place that after you went to Studio 54, or if you couldn't get into Studio 54, you would go to Xenon, and which was generally in the same area. And you could more likely get into it than you could Studio 54. There was a better chance. It didn't have the diversity that Studio 54 had, although, it didn't lack diversity either, but it wasn't as prominent there. It wasn't as much of a show as Studio 54 was. And the music, it was fine. The sound system was terrific, state of the art. Studio 54 had some legendary DJs, Nicky Ciano, and Xenon had some well-known DJs, but it just never achieved that level of celebrity or status that Studio 54 had. It was a great place. There was a couple of people there that I loved photographing. Gypsy, who is a transgender woman from Puerto Rico, was there a lot, brought a lot of her friends along, and was very entertaining and loved attention. Loved when I came by with my camera. Loved the environment, loved the spirit of the place. Again, it was a great mix and a great place for the trans culture of that period, a lot of these clubs. It was a safe space for them. It was a safe haven for them. They walked in off the streets of New York City, which was at that time in the 70s. New York City's always been a place of inclusion. It's always been the melting pot compared to other cities in New York, in America. But it still had its homophobia. Being a trans or cross-dresser or transvestite, as it was called back then, being a person who walked around like that, they honestly risked their lives walking through the city at night like that. Once they got to a place like Xenon, they were safe. They were not only safe, but they were welcomed and, they were encouraged. They were like, come and be yourself, And so that was a lot in general of what I was drawn to by those places.
Yeah, that's awesome. They're nice at this size. Yeah, it's a good size. People down in Palm Beach have big houses with lots of wall space. But I like this size a lot. It just holds, especially for this sort of negative. That looks great too. I love it. The highlights on it, the water or the gel or whatever it is, really pops it out. Yeah, it's great.
As I was shooting back then, I didn't really have the perspective that what I was seeing and what I was shooting and what I was being basically energized by and turned on by at these clubs, that it was really going to, in years to come, 40 years on, was going to have the interest that it does today. I did not have that awareness back then. It took a long time, actually, for me to have that awareness because in around 81, there was a real cultural backlash to disco. People wanted their rock and roll back. Disco had become overly commercialized. They were selling toys, with disco music. They completely they took disco and the popularity of disco and just, tried to wring as much money out of it as they could. And it really backfired. And so by the late 70s, early 80s, basically, disco, I would say, was almost like a dirty word. Disco was almost a joke to Americans because they had been oversaturated with it by corporations, by big business, by advertising. So, and there was also a backlash. There was somewhat of a racially motivated backlash because who were the stars of disco? Like black females, Donna Summer, Gloria Gaynor. That wasn't the case with rock and roll music. So there were a lot of forces at work, and there was also a conservative political force at work that in 1980 elected Ronald Reagan as president. That was all part of it, I think. And the AIDS crisis, AIDS in the 80s, early 80s, was the plague in a way. People didn't know what caused it. If I'm at a disco and somebody sweats and I get some of their sweat on me, can I get AIDS from that? If I touch somebody, can I get AIDS from that? If they breathe on me? I mean, there was so little information at that point, but they knew that it was really devastating, especially the gay population, that people were afraid, so there was less desire even to go out at night for a while.
I gotta sign these. When should I sign them?
Try it.
Okay, ready?
I guess neon was new in a way because you could create designs with neon. So it gave the lighting aspect to the discos a whole other realm to work with. Xenon actually was pretty much ahead of the other discos. One huge panel that used to drop down during the course of the night, which had like an American flag on it and a gorilla beating its chest. And, there was a lot going on in this scene that would drop down for a period of time. They also had what looked like pinball machines dropping down that you would bump up against, and they would react to you bumping up against it. So they created scenery, basically using neon. I hadn't really seen used like that before. And, it was just another device to change the vibe of the room during the course of the night to just keep your energy level up, and the music was orchestrated to work with the setting of the room as well. There'd be darker moments when the music would slow down. Then all of a sudden things would get really bright and something would happen, some lighting event would happen, and the music would just pick up again. So there was this coordination between the set and the lighting and the music that created different moments, time periods during the course of the night. The energy was brought down, the energy was brought back up, and all this was orchestrated by the DJ. And it was created every night in reaction to what he was feeling coming from the crowd. So it was almost like a work of art every night. I thought that the Moon and Coke Spoon at Studio 54 was brilliant. And I think it was also pretty ballsy of them to do that. Coke was definitely a popular drug during the 70s. And it was a perfect drug for a disco because it gave you all that energy that you wanted to dance. And it just worked so well with the sound and the music. And it also had a certain cachet to it that, if you brought a line of Coke, you were a cool guy or you were a rich person maybe because it wasn't cheap. It had a certain element of, status or something to it, being able to lay down a line of Coke. But it wasn't really, it was certainly not a legal drug. And it was certainly not something that you did out in the open. Except if you were in a nightclub. So putting the Moon and Coke Spoon in full view every night was a statement. It's like, it was kind of like giving a finger to like straight society and saying that, we're here, we're doing Coke here. I think it had that just enough of like an anti-establishment feel to it. It was cool. It worked. There were many things going on in the clubs at night. I don't think there was necessarily one mental attitude except to go and mix with people and have a good time and party, celebrating their freedom of expression and openness and ability to be in a place where it's all accepted and welcomed. And they felt like, in many ways, they felt like they were the stars of the night. They were the celebrities. And then there was also there was the women's movement, and they were celebrating the fact that they had a voice finally. And the African American culture was celebrating the fact that they were starting to get a voice. And there was the Wall Street crowd that was at that time doing quite well and bringing the cocaine, and they were celebrating their success. To me, the celebrities went to mix with these people. To them was what was great about a lot of these clubs, is that the environment was so creative and inclusive and cool that it was a place that they could go and have fun with people. different, it was a different scene to different people. And that's what was really interesting to me about it. Fashion was very important. It was an important element at every club, but in its own way. In other words, the 70s fashion, hairstyles, the bell bottoms and the pantsuits, and in some ways the big hair and the sexiness was pretty part of the scene at clubs like Studio 54 and Xenon. And that was the costume for that tribe, that went there. And there was also the creative element that would show up in their own design. People would study them. Halston was at Studio 54 a lot, and I'm sure he was looking around to see what people were wearing. What's hot right now? What's going on? Celebrities were looking to see. This was like a breeding ground for things like fashion. This is where people got ideas. So that was pretty much the tribe, if I can call it that went to places like Xenon and Studio 54. The tribe that went to the Mud Club was different. That was more of the ripped jean, safety pin, pierced ear, pierced nose, pierced cheek look, tattoos. It was more the downtown punk feeling, vibe, I would say. Paradise Garage had its own vibe also, which was go to dance vibe. It was T-shirt and jeans. It wasn't necessarily any sort of high-end fashion. Dancing, disco, get down and get, sweaty fashion. Different clubs had different tribes and different costumes.
I mean, some of these have a little more detail than others, but
I tended not to go to a lot of the special events, special parties, just because, or theme parties, because to me, I wanted to capture more of the real, New York City nightlife scene. Although that was part of it, but, I tended to go when I didn't know who was going to be there. There were nights when they would invite certain people, Grace Jones or somebody, and I wasn't as interested in that as I was trying to capture the flavor of just a regular night. So I was always happy to see certain people. Like one of the people was Rollerina, would appear in a gown with sometimes like a crown or some sort of hat and glasses and roller skates and a wand. She would bless the crowd and skate around, do her own little skating. And evidently she was like a Wall Street banker during the day, had a pretty straight job. I don't know what his/her name was, but she was known as Rollerina and would appear in roller skates and costume and go around roller skating and bless people on the street. A great vibe, a really great vibe, and somebody who was really had created this persona, living this persona. And these clubs were like perfect places to live out this dream, and this fantasy that they were living. One of the pictures in this exhibit, Rollerina with a badge that says, "How dare you presume I'm heterosexual," which I love. So she was someone who I was always happy to see.
and like in here. These things were great on the smaller one. Do you have that smaller version that we looked at? Yeah, I just want to compare. I'm just trying to see what happens when it blows up.
Yeah, well, my intention was to try to capture all of the stuff that I was seeing there that was so unique to me. And that was luckily so visually interesting. It's one thing to be somewhere and understand that there's something interesting going on, but not being able to see it or photograph it. And another thing to actually be somewhere where something's going on that is very visual. So yeah, I was interested in all of the different aspects of different tribes, different cultures that I was seeing, and their visual representation. That was really what was driving me at that point. Two different ends of the spectrum. We're talking about the celebrity and the socially elite, maybe business crowd, entertainment crowd that brought the drugs or had access to the drugs. And the other aspect is the creative New Yorkers, the New York energy, the New York creative vibe that was there, that weren't necessarily celebrities or wealthy, but they brought a lot to the party. And what they brought to the party was what the celebrities wanted to see and the upscale crowd wanted to see. So yeah, there were really two elements that were mixing, and it was seamless. There was a seamless blending of the two that I had never seen before either. And, just to give you a little history of my background, I was sort of brought up around, I grew up around the Woodstock era and the Woodstock generation and hippies and that sort of thing. And hippies had their own costume, a work shirt and a pair of jeans, bell-bottom jeans, and long hair. And, that was kind of, we all thought of ourselves as being these great nonconformists. But when you look at us, we were really conformists, the first degree in a lot of ways. We were nonconformists in terms of like our beliefs in like, what society should be about and value systems, the anti-materialistic belief system, that the hippies had, anti-establishment, anti-materialistic, anti-Vietnam War. But there wasn't that much diversity. If you watch the movie Woodstock, if you go back and look at it, you can count on like one hand how many African Americans there are in the audience. Most of the African Americans were on stage performing. And in terms of the, LGBT, it's hard to tell, but it didn't look like there was really much representation, in that movie. And even during that time period, it was before a lot of things really, a lot of the movements were in play at that time, but it was before they had actually sort of broken through and became more part of the culture. So they were still seen as a little bit of a marginalized or subculture. So that's where I was coming from as a photographer and as an artist. And so when I stepped into the world of Studio 54 that night and saw this, massive inclusion, I was just kind of blown away. Just some more in here. It might be impossible. I get that.
It's always worth a look.
Yeah, just try. I think that there was an excitement back then about the fact that things were happening in the culture pointed to inclusion. And I think there was an excitement about how they had made a certain amount of progress in their movements, achieved a certain voice, and sense of power from a lot of things that went down in the 60s. And I think that was a big part of what made it so exciting. But I also think that we witnessed right after that period, come the 80s, come Ronald Reagan, come the AIDS crisis, was like a gigantic pendulum swinging back. It was still a sense of power, but it was now power that had to be directed towards some very real things, like the AIDS crisis. And so the LGBT movement became the voice that demanded that the Reagan administration start talking about AIDS. For the first couple of years, he didn't even want to talk about it. He didn't want to know about it, basically. Then empowered LGBT movement made him talk about it, act up, demonstrations, there were protests. There was a new sense of being empowered to actually deal with real issues in our culture. So I think the sense of empowerment lasted, but we faced some, as a society, we faced a lot of real issues. Kind of like a little bit like that party was over. In some ways, a lot of real life started seeping in. And then that went on for quite a while. What happened to me personally as an artist was early 2000s. I got a call from a music producer in London, was familiar with my work from back then. And he said, there's a resurgence of interest in disco and in that culture right now. I think the pictures that you have would make a great coffee table book. I said to him, I'd be delighted. That would be amazing. See if you can find a publisher, which he ended up doing. The book was finally published in 2015 called Disco, the Bill Bernstein Photographs by Real Art Press in London. And they asked me to write a foreword for the book in 2015. And I was really trying to think of what to write because disco music had evolved and transformed since the 70s. It turned into house music. It turned into EDM. It just evolved over time. And I was trying to think about the culture and sort of when I last looked at the 70s and the disco culture, it was really no longer like that. The clubs were no longer like those clubs that I photographed. So I was trying to think, well, what can I say what's relevant about that time, that I can say in my forward. And it was just at that time when a few things happened in the culture. First of all, the Supreme Court passed the Equal Marriage Amendment, nationally mandated that, you could get, no matter what state you were in, you as a gay couple could get married under the eyes of the law. So that happened, and I sort of went like, that's interesting. And then it was really within a few months, I think, that they decided to you couldn't bar transgender men and women from being in the military. I was like, wow, okay, that's pretty interesting too. And then within that time period, there was a lot of discussion about the Confederate flag in the South and what it represented. And there was an incident down there where there was a killing in a church. People just said, let's really look at this. And what is a Confederate flag really saying? And so there was a consciousness in mainstream culture, an awareness, an evolution, and what felt like a sea change in cultural consciousness back when I was writing my foreword. And I thought to myself, well, this is really what I was seeing 40 years ago in that room, in those rooms, in those discos. That was really kind of lighting me up inside in a way. And now it's become part of our mainstream culture. And isn't that interesting? Isn't that really something? And so that kind of became my forward, that I had a sneak peek of what's happening in mainstream culture.
Really in your face.
It's going to make a statement.
Yeah. That's great. You notice all the little details in it, the way he's holding his hand here with his finger in his hand. And this guy's got his sunglasses on. I don't even know where he is. Yeah. It's interesting to see this guy.
A little beanie.
Yeah. It's funny how nobody's looking at the camera.
Yeah. Well, could they even see you in this and all this?
I think they could, but I don't think they cared. I think they were so involved.
Yeah.
That wasn't.
All these lights up here are probably going off as well for strobes, so just probably not even noticing
A flash
going off.
Yeah. But it's all just a lucky shot. You know, you could shoot and get a lot of different things, but somehow, like this guy's just a star here, I think.
Yeah.
You know, and he's perfectly sharp. You know, and it was lucky because you couldn't really see what you were shooting. It was dark. You know.
After I wrote that forward and the book came out, that I felt, well, you know, then we had Obama as president. I mean, that was pretty amazing for our mainstream culture. But then we had the old pendulum swung back again with Trump. And so much of what was happening in the mainstream culture, inclusion-wise, was trying to be picked apart. And there was a huge reaction to it. And there still is today, you know, as I speak. There still is this whole, these white supremacist groups that have been turned on and are communicating and, you know, are a scary force. Homophobia, anti-Semitism, all of these like forces are out there in a way that is very, very scary. But it's a reaction to how far our culture has gone in being inclusive. In my heart, as a person, as an artist, as a member of society, to really believe that inclusion and acceptance is the way to go. And that's the right side of history. And all of these forces that are fighting against it, they aren't as powerful. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And we are clearly now in the post-Trump era. We're still reeling from all of that hatred. You know, we've elected a president. I don't know what you know, people's politics are, but I'm not in favor of hate in my life, in my world. You know, I don't like it. I was happy when Biden was elected because I think his heart's in the right place. And I think he's a good force for the most part. We're swinging back. Culture's definitely swinging back. And as a New Yorker going through the pandemic, I'm looking around at New York right now, and New York is starting to remind me of New York in the 70s. People are fleeing New York, so rents are going way down. It's not as safe to live in New York as it was 10 months ago before the pandemic. Buildings are boarded up, windows are broken. It's starting to feel a little bit like the 70s again with the garbage strikes that happened back then, you know, and just the fact that the city is so economically hurting. Back in the 70s, there were fires would start in the Bronx and like there just weren't enough firemen to go put the fire out. So they would just let the building burn, you know. Garbage was piled up outside. We're not quite there yet, like here in 2021, but it sort of feels a bit like that. And with that feels like it's going to bring in a new crop of people who can afford the lesser rents in New York City, like a new surge of energy. And in the next few years, if you're interested in opening up a cool club, there's spaces that are affordable now because people have moved out. So there could be a real resurgence coming around the corner, especially in New York City, I think. I'm hopeful that happens. I have a lot of friends who are DJs and in the music business and in the nightclub business who are, you know, basically sitting around just waiting for it to come back. So, but I think there's a good chance that it will. You know, I'm hopeful that it will. And it will be a good scene.
Like highlights in here, you know. It's really nice. It's doing a lot of work.
Yeah, I think the energy of the 70s, the late 70s at those clubs, I think that's, you know, definitely possible. I think it will happen again. I mean, just as a small sample, you know, I live out here in Brooklyn in Windsor Terrace and Park Slope area. And the day that it was formally announced that Biden won the election, I mean, people were dancing in the streets. I mean, I had never seen anything like that before. And that is the feeling that you have when you feel like when freedom of expression is in the air and inclusion is in the air and oppression has been driven out. And I think that is part that to me was that feeling that was present back in the late 70s. So yes, it's totally possible to feel it. It's like that was a perfect storm back then of a lot of different positive movements set against the backdrop of a city that was in default, set up against a time when a new music appeared on the scene that was, not rock and roll, but it was a party music. It was celebratory music, So there were a lot of factors in place back then that all created that moment of time for that to happen. And is it possible to happen again? Absolutely. It won't look exactly like that, but there will be a set of circumstances that comes about that creates that kind of feeling again in the future. In the 70s, pre-digital, color film was not as advanced then as it became, in the 80s and the 90s. The sensitivity of color film, good color film that would really represent the colors truly or enhance them to some extent. The one film that I used to use back then once in a while was Kodachrome, which was 25 ASA. And that's way too slow a film. The sensitivity of that film is way, way, way too, it's way too insensitive to light. You need a lot of light. It's great for shooting outside. It's great for shooting with strobe lights or hot lights. But for shooting in a dark club, it's really a very hard film to work with. Aside from that, there was something about the black and white aesthetic that I was very drawn to. The photographers whose work I was just in love with were photographers like Richard Avedon, Irving Penn, Diane Arbus, William Klein. Most of that work was black and white. To me, the fine art work, to me, the documentary work, the work that really had the depth to it was black and white. Color was something else. Color was like almost a novelty, and it was almost something that you used for specific purposes. Black and white was like the true film to use, and it was the true expression of the fine art photographer. And that's true even today, in my opinion. People choose to shoot black and white film, as opposed to even black and white digital today, because there is a certain quality to it in the same way that in music, there's a quality to vinyl that is so different than the digital, and you feel it, and it's the same thing with film. It's something that you feel when you look at a picture. It's not even something you can almost describe. You can't even, you can use words to describe it, but it's more like a feeling that you have. And so, yeah, I'm really happy I shot these in black and white. And what happens to them in black and white when you use a fast film like Tri-X is you get a lot of grain in the pictures. In digital, you get pixels, you get pixelated. But in film, you get grain. And that's a sort of very organic looking thing. And so today, when you blow up Tri-X film, as large as a lot of the pictures in this exhibit, you really feel that. You see that grain, and it's organic. It's textural, and it's another element in a way to these pictures, and it gives it a sense of time and place, and it adds another element to it. Seeing these pictures blown up to this size is a whole other experience to me. Aside from the fact that when you look at a picture of like Larry Levan involved in, queuing up a record during the course of the night for Paradise Garage. He's almost life-size in that picture. I was kind of crouched down near the board, the mixing board, taking some pictures, and you're there when it's blown up that big. He's right there. So it's really an amazing process. And that film really lends itself well to that, I think. Film and digital are really two different aesthetics. They're two different realms, in a sense. And each can be appreciated for its own unique qualities. I remember recently seeing the movie Roma on TV, which was shot digitally, and just having an amazing experience watching that movie. And part of it was, I think, that it was digital, and that the detail in the shadows in that picture and in the highlights was just remarkable to me visually. And so there's that experience, which is amazing. Versus when you look at a black and white film movie, which has its own aesthetic, So can you mix the two eventually? I don't know that you really want to necessarily. The other part of it is that there's already like a intermarriage of digital and film going on right now. For example, a lot of people shoot film and then they have it scanned, their film scanned, and they have it printed digitally. There's that going on, and where you still capture digitally the essence of black and white or color film, and you reproduce it, and it still has some of that film quality to it, but it's, half film, half digital, So I like the preciseness that you can get with digital. What I loved about black and white or film were the accidents that happened, like the happy accidents. As I was shooting at Studio 54 or any of those called Mud Club, I never knew what I got until the next day when I processed the film. I didn't, there were some surprises on there, stuff that I didn't expect to get that just happened by accident. And there were some things that I thought I got that I didn't get. So it was kind of it was a different methodology shooting black and white. Shooting digital, you still want those happy accidents to happen, but you can just control so much more in the digital process. Photoshop. I mean, what can't you do with Photoshop? Almost too much. I mean, when you're working with Photoshop, the problem is, when do you stop? Because you can go to the pixel level and lighten, darken, change the color. I mean, you can just keep going forever. So, which has its pluses and its minuses. It really is like listening to digital music digitally and listening to it, analog, on vinyl. They're two different things, and you appreciate them both for what, for the qualities that they both have. Work one, Larry Levan contact sheet. I managed to spend some time with Larry one night up in his DJ booth. And it was kind of like his personal sanctuary up there. For the most part, it was just him. Occasionally people would go up to visit, but I was lucky to go up there that night and hang out with him for a little while. He was very, for the most of the part, he was very intense and watching the audience while he was working, thumbing through records. He'd turn his back to me and thumb through records a lot. But he was really kind of like, and dancing. He was really kind of very attuned to the audience. The contact sheet of Larry Levan was taken one night when I had the opportunity to go up there and hang out with him the DJ booth is really a sanctuary. And normally for most of the evening, he's up there by himself. Occasionally people, will stop in. But so I had some time with him. What I noticed is that he was very attuned to the audience. He was watching the crowd. He was thumbing through records. He was thinking about songs. We didn't really talk that much. I didn't want to disturb him. He was like in the middle of his work, He was great. I was there. He posed for me a couple of times. But I was more interested in just sort of like picking up his vibe, and being in his presence, and seeing what that felt like. And it felt like somebody who was really connected in some almost spiritual way with the music and the crowd and absorbing it, and like a medium, like what does the crowd need now? They need this song. So I was happy to be able to do that. I honestly, I don't normally shoot that many images of one person. The contact sheets are really different. Some of the contact sheets that are in the exhibit, I had one or two shots of a subject, and that was it. But in this case, since I was there, I just wanted to grab as much stuff as I could because I didn't know if I'd be back there again, So that's why there's so many shots. It was just trying to take advantage of that opportunity. And the one shot that I selected, to me, shows Larry really in action, listening, watching the crowd. And I love the fact that when I was shooting it, I was kind of crouched down, looking up at him while he was working, and he put his hand out, almost touching the camera. So when I saw that on the contact sheet, I thought, wow, this just really puts you, it's just so much dimension, with the hand reaching out. It just really puts you in the DJ booth with him in a way that I guess I had never seen before, And the fact that it's blown up so large is, like I said before, it's almost like you're in the room with him, The poster or the album cover of Robin Williams, Reality, What a Concept, was just there. I don't know why it was there. We didn't really talk about it. And honestly, I was so overwhelmed and thrilled to be there and pick up on his vibe that I didn't even really think about it when I was there. It was just part of his scene, So I probably would have, in retrospect, I might have asked him, why that was there, but I didn't because I was so focused on him, Contact sheet one here. This was a party one night at Studio 54. And in this contact sheet, you'll see that I was really looking around. I was going from place to place. It was, over the course of a period of time. It started towards the end of the night, and it went into probably the end of the night. And there's several shots on here that I would consider kind of prize shots that I ended up being very, very happy with. Ordinarily, if I'm shooting an event like this, I'm happy if I get like one or two good shots in it that I feel have really captured something. And I think I did extraordinarily well with this contact sheet. As a photographer, I'm very happy with this. There are different scenes. There are different aspects of the night. They tell different stories. This is one of my prize contact sheets from this body of work, I would say. Starting off on the top, there's a great shot. There's some dancing going on in the dance floor, but and it's towards the end of the night. But the shot of the three people standing in the stairway is an exceptional shot to me. It has a real flavor of a different time period, maybe like the 40s, just by the costumes. He's got sort of almost a military outfit on from World War II, and she looks like an actress from the 40s. And also Kid Creole is in that picture. he's peeking over at the guy. You just see basically part of his face with his eye. And she's looking directly at the taller guy in the front. And there's this look of like, to me anyway, it's like, I'm taking you home tonight. It has this very sort of secret meeting, menage a trois almost feeling to it that I love. And it's in this top of the staircase where they're alone, and just the pose and the costume and the feeling and it's like a set. It's like a still from a movie set. I just love it. And then on the next level down, there's a great shot of Patassa de la Lafayette, who was at the time one of the most famous transvestites, as they called it back then. Now it's transgender, but she was a model. She was a high fashion model, and a big partier. Good friends with Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol took a famous picture of her, I believe, with her penis, which was of quite a large size, sticking out. That's one of the things I know about Patessa. But Patessa was really a lot of fun. And, we sort of would play with each other. She would come out and pose for me, without saying anything. And I would take a few pictures. And then this night she just like grabbed a chair and brought it into the middle of the dance floor and started posing for me. So, that to me is a great picture. There also is Kid Creole in that picture dancing next to her. But she was an icon of the day and a regular at Studio 54, as well as other clubs. But obviously having a great time. Underneath that is the famous Moon and Coke Spoon. And again, towards the end of the evening, it was just sort of sitting there, and this couple decided to go over and just sit underneath it. And to me, it looked like a sort of Hollywood version of, a romantic setting, a couple sitting underneath, the moon. But in this case, it was, the Studio 54 Moon and Coke Spoon, and very much iconic, linked to Studio 54. There's a picture on the second to bottom, a guy going down the catwalk with like a garden hose under his arm. And he's like dragging this garden hose down the catwalk. And he's got on like a jock strap or and he's got something wrapped around his head. And he's clearly out of his mind, drunk and whatever. And it's the end of the night. And his name is Victor Hugo. That was the name that he took on. He was from South America, and he was the boyfriend of Halston. Halston didn't quite know what to do with him. They were partners, and he didn't quite know what to do with him, so he made him his official window dresser. And he was famous in his own right, just for being, who he was, which was a kind of a wild partier and kind of a gigolo, I guess you would say. Beginning of the night, he's in a tuxedo and he's kind of part of the party. But by the end of the night, he's just about naked and, sort of like just traipsing through Studio 54 in this like wild, abandoned way. Contact sheet 2, which is artwork number 5, has a couple of things in it that are kind of unique. One was Divine, who was an underground film star of the time that was quite well known. John Waters, the director, used Divine in a number of his pictures and kind of discovered Divine. And I think they were both from Baltimore, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But Divine was a bit of a fixture at Studio 54. And so there were a couple of pictures of Divine in there during the evening. Again, I wasn't particularly all that interested in, big star celebrities, but people like Divine I thought were interesting in their own right. Independent film, people who really had a strong creative input into the culture. There's also a picture of a woman seated amongst a number of like flowers and bushes and leaves. And this was part of the event. It was an India event. And it was actually the same night as the other contact sheet, that same night. She was just part of the decor from that night. And she really, she was just sort of almost like a mannequin that was part of, the vibe of kind of trying to recreate an India sort of experience. I love her pose, and I love her pose and her dress and the ornamentation on her dress, next to all of the, vegetation around her. And there is another woman there that's off to the side that you just see part of her dress and her arm, part of her arm. So that she was almost like a decoration, but she was so alive to me, that I thought there was an interesting picture there. Also on that contact sheet, there's Steve Rebell and Halston on the bottom, and they're sort of saying goodnight to each other at that point. And there's a kind of a two school children in the playground feeling about the two of them. I think Steve was a little bit in love with Halston, and Halston was a little enamored of Steve Rebell. And I think that sort of comes through there. Artwork number 7. This contact sheet is the first role that I took the very first night that I went to Studio 54. It's very significant to me in that I went there to cover an event for the Village Voice. Lillian Carter receiving some honors for her work in India. And there were tables set up throughout the dance floor. There are a couple shots on here that I think are great. First of all, it was my first exposure to the world of paparazzi. This is 1977. And so the image of Lillian Carter sitting there with Andy Warhol, Robert Mapplethorpe is also at this table, and a number of other people. I turned around and I saw this scene it was a sea of photographers, crouching over each other, trying to get this picture. And to me, that was like a Greek frieze of in modern day photography, paparazzi in its fullest form right there. So I took a couple of shots of that, which I love. And then I went back and I photographed Lillian Carter talking to Andy Warhol. And I kind of wondered, I wonder what they're talking about. Like, what are these two white-haired people from like separate universes? What's their common ground? I never really knew. Underneath that, there's a really important picture, the Studio 54 couple. I think that I took 2 shots of them. One was when I first saw them, and there's a shot of the two of them, and Divine is in the background. And then when I saw them, I was tempted to just say, can I just take you off to the side, and take a picture of you two? And they said, sure. And so we went over to the side, and I snapped that one picture of them as a couple. And that was it. And it's interesting to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, normally I would take more than one picture, but that night I took just that one picture. And the chances of taking one picture of 2 people and having it turn out so well in itself is pretty rare. That someone isn't blinking, someone isn't looking away, that it's just so perfect. They also, to me, helped me set the course for the next 2 years of my life photographing at disco. They looked to me like a pre-war Berlin, Weimar Republic couple, something out of the movie Cabaret. And there was a decadence about them. There was a sense of gender bending. There was just something very cabaret about them. And when I started to think about it, I looked around the room and all of a sudden I felt this connection to that time period. And that what I was witnessing in front of me, all of this partying, like, till you drop dead, partying, and all of this gender bending that was going on and mix of people, was very reminiscent to me of that time. So I started to feel like they were my muse, in a sense. They represented to me what was happening during that time. And it put my head in a certain place where, I was seeing it almost through those kind of glasses of that time period. So that's a really important picture to me. Mud Club contact sheet. The Mud Club contact sheet was taken in what was really a very famous, or I should say infamous place, which was the Mud Club bathroom. And that's where a lot of stuff happened. It was famous for kind of fornication, for drug taking, drug dealing, all kinds of stuff. And so I had to go in there, of course. And it was unisex, which was, not that usual back in 1979. There were a couple of people in there, and that the blonde standing there was kind of a representative of, the sort of person that went to that club. And I'd seen her there a couple of times before, so we kind of knew each other. And so I asked her if I could take some pictures of her, and she started posing by the mirror. And the thing I love about this picture is, aside from her and her style and her fashion and her attitude, is the graffiti on the walls. The misfits, better dead on red. I think that refers to reds meaning secanols, but I'm not 100% sure, because the seconol, the sedative drug, was kind of very popular back then in that environment. So I think that's the reference that was made there. Then another woman came in, and I shot some pictures of her against the wall. And then there's a guy in the cast. Again, here I'm shooting a few more frames of each person than I did in some of the earlier ones. I'm trying to get them to move around. I'm talking to them as I'm photographing them. I am, trying to have some selection, some choice, later on when I'm looking at a contact sheet, what really sort of captures it compositionally, maybe lighting wise, body posture, body language, all those kinds of things. Sometimes the flash wouldn't go off. So, a couple of frames at the very beginning are like, probably I just loaded up the film, and so I'm shooting the floor, which happens on a contact sheet. The woman standing by the mirror, again, is just, the kind of fashion and style that you saw back then at the Mud Club. Not on everybody. It was somewhat typical as compared to the fashion, the high-end fashion that you would see at a place like Studio 54. This was a downtown, funkier feel. And the music was different, and the pose was different. And, the graffiti, those groups were like, they weren't really disco groups. They were like, they were serious, new wave and punk bands. So that was the vibe of that.